Welcome to Conversations. One of the challenges facing researchers today are finding appropriate grant resources. So how do you find grants? Our guest today knows all about the grant research process. For many years, Linda Galloway worked in various capacities at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry, SUNY ESF. She assisted faculty with research, and then in 2004, she received her Master's of Library Science degree and joined the staff at the F. Franklin Moon Library, where she was Senior Assistant Librarian. Now Linda Galloway is Associate Librarian at Syracuse University, and she's come back to talk with us at SUNY ESF today about finding grants. Welcome back, Linda. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Jane. It's great to be back.
So Linda, let's talk about what you would do if you were looking for grants. How would one get started? Walk us through that process.
Well, if I'm a faculty researcher and I'm looking for grants, I probably would start with the database grants.gov. It's a federal funding database of grant opportunities from 44 different federal agencies and many sub-agencies. So it's a huge database with lots of information in there. You can set up alerts so that you're notified of new funding opportunities by a particular agency or in a particular area of interest. We also have a publication here at SUNY ESF called the Research Times, which contains funding opportunities relevant to ESF researchers and their students, both graduate and undergraduate students.
So Linda, if you're searching grants.gov, how difficult is it to get in there and do a search? Can you walk us through how you would go in and do a search? Is it pretty simple, or can you get into advanced searches?
Sure,
is it pretty
Jane.
Easy to use?
It's fairly easy to use, but it is a big database, and the information can be displayed in a slightly confusing fashion. So if you're interested in, say, researching black bears, you might want to put in the search term bear research, and you would see what kind of information you would get out. You'd have to sort your funding opportunities by when the applications were due, things of that nature. But it's fairly easy to search, but you will retrieve a lot of results that you'll then have to sort through.
Now, you mentioned about alerts. How do you set up alerts in something like grants.gov so that when I'm doing my research I can be alerted? Can you talk more about the alerts and what they can do for me and how to set those up?
Sure. They're easy to set up, but one of the limitations of grants.gov is you can't get very specific. So I could, for example, get an alert every week for NSF research opportunities.
NSF?
Oh, that's the National Science Foundation.
Okay. Oh.
So I could get an alert every week or with those kind of funding opportunities. But it's hard to get really specific. If you're only interested in biogeochemical research, for example, it's hard to just retrieve those funding opportunities. So you'll end up finding more information than you need, but it's still possible to get an alert, which I do every week or every day, and new funding opportunities that have been recently added to the database or have been recently updated with, say, a new due date.
So when I'm in grants.gov, I find my appropriate keywords, and then there's an option there to have it email me. And is that called something special? Is there a special name for that?
They're just called alerts.
Alerts, okay.
Yeah.
I had heard them called RSS feeds. Is that similar or is that different?
Well, an RSS feed is a way that you can retrieve alerts, but it has to be, an RSS feed has to be read by an RSS feed reader that you can put in like your Google.
So that's yet another component that someone would have to be working with, another software, another tool on the internet.
Exactly. Now, if somebody's interested in receiving an RSS feed of funding opportunities that are relevant to ESF researchers, on a homepage that we've created, ESF Grant Search, you could subscribe to our Twitter feed of funding opportunities, and that would be an RSS feed that you could read daily or weekly. So
that's fabulous. That there's a special database just for grants for federal funding. It's really fabulous. Let's talk a little bit more about other databases, because that's a free database just specific for federal grants. Are there any other databases that you recommend to people whether you subscribe or not to them. What other databases do you recommend?
The other databases that we recommend are both subscription databases, but they contain information on a lot of private funding agencies, foundations, and other types of private funding agencies. And the two that we have subscriptions to here at SUNY ESF are, one is called the Foundation Directory Online, that I know you're familiar with, and that has information on grant opportunities and also on the funding agencies themselves. So you could see any federal filings that they've had to file, who has been supported by their funding opportunities, who the principal owners of the sites are. And so you can find out information like that from Foundation Directory Online. And that is a subscription database, but most libraries, public libraries, do have a subscription to that too. So
that's great. So anyone who hears about Foundation Directory could visit the public library, or if they're a grad student or faculty, visit their library at their school and probably get access to it. Now, Linda, when you work with faculty and grad students and other students, what do you find is the biggest stumbling block, so to speak, that people have to get over to dive into searching for grants? Do you find that you just need to push people over a certain point? What's the point, I mean, where you need to be helping them? Is it just getting started? Is it while they're doing their research?
I think it gets overwhelming when people try to search the databases because they're not as user-friendly as some of the databases that we're familiar with in the library. They retrieve often too many results, and then you're wading through all this information that may be irrelevant. You might retrieve funding opportunities where the due date has passed a year ago. So there are stumbling blocks.
It's an educational process.
It is.
For both the user and the librarian, the relationship of teaching them to use these.
And that's actually why probably a librarian is really good as a mentor or as somebody who helps people find funding, because we're able to sort through many resources and find the most relevant ones and push them out to our constituents.
So far we've talked about grants.gov, which is the federal database, and we've touched on Foundation Directory, which is a subscription database. And I believe we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk more with Linda Galloway about more ways to do grant research. Welcome back to Conversations. We're talking with Linda Galloway, Associate Librarian at Syracuse University, and we're going to continue our conversation about grants. Linda, we were just talking about Foundation Directory. It's a subscription database to find grants available from private institutions. Now, I did have a question, and I don't know if I know how to word this right, but I understand that some foundation groups have to file certain IRS forms, and that they're searchable through databases like Foundation Directory. What is that form? It's the 40. It's like a 409, and it's a special form where people can actually see who people are giving the funding to. Do you know about that form in Foundation Directory, that you can actually see all the people that foundations are giving funding to, and that might be helpful?
Oh, definitely, because you can then try to figure out how to tailor your application to meet the needs of the funding agency. So yeah, all those federal filings are available through the Foundation
Directory. I just thought of that because I'd heard about that tax form and how valuable it can be, and it's not something that you would obviously find in some of the databases, but I think in Foundation Directory that is a valuable form there.
Yeah, it's one of the strengths of the Foundation Directory Online in that all the information that's required to be filed by the federal government for these funding agencies is available through the Foundation Directory Online.
And it's really helpful to someone who's trying to streamline their search and find the right foundation to give them money for their research. So moving on from Foundation Directory, there's another fabulous database that you wanted to talk about, COS, and what does that stand for, COS?
Well, it was called the Community of Science, and it's been updated, purchased, and by another vendor. So right now it's called COS/Pivot, P-I-V-O-T, and that is a new, it is a revamped database that contains funding opportunities from both private foundations and federal agencies. So it's kind of a one-stop shopping. It's got a nice interface for searching. You can set up searches and then get notified if any of the funding opportunities that have been recently added to the database meet your specific criteria. So you can get really specific and create searches that exactly meet your needs.
Mm-hmm. Now, Linda, when you've helped a number of faculty and grad students do their research. I'm just curious, what kind of monetary amounts are people looking at? And what kind of monetary amounts are available out there? Are we talking, small, medium, large? I mean, what kind of amounts have you seen available out there for grants?
Well, it does vary. So some funding opportunities, for example, from the National Science Foundation, could be $500,000.
Wow.
And then I recently had a request for a small amount of funding just to get a researcher through the summer. So it really varies. And so this individual who needed just $5,000 to get through the summer was able to find a private foundation that could fund that.
And you help them, guide them through that process, find the right database, do the right search, and find the right grant opportunity. Now, what happens, I don't know, the answer to this was why I'm asking you. What happens if a grant isn't given to anyone? Do you know what happens to that money? Do they just give it again the next year, or do you know what happens to unclaimed grants? I'm just curious.
I'm not aware of unclaimed grants, but
because they usually just get taken up.
But a private foundation may choose to not fund anybody for a certain year while if their investments are not doing as well as in previous years. So. Private foundation funding isn't always guaranteed, and actually neither is federal funding, because recently the EPA just pulled back from a green chemistry funding program that they had. Mm-hmm.
Now, we talked about starting and the process, and now we talked about the money. What's the timeline? Like, let's say I come to you and say, Linda, I need to find funding for the summer. It's probably too late now because the summer's coming up, but when someone comes to you and says, I need to find a grant for this time frame, how much time do you think it takes somebody to find the right database, do the searching, find the grant, do the application, and then receive word back? What do you think is the span of time that takes?
It can be anywhere from several months to close to a year. So it just depends on how difficult the application is to complete. People at ESF always have to go through the Office of Research programs to facilitate the funding process. The Office of Research programs helps individuals apply. They have all the forms pre-filled for many federal agencies. So it really depends on what kind of funding is required or what kind of application you need to fill out.
And most of the databases we've talked about, the application is right there. It's either right on the screen or it's available in PDF. Is that usually the case? It's right there?
Generally, yes. Occasionally we have funding opportunities that only come via email, and in those cases we will post them on a website for our researchers to access. So
now, you mentioned the National Science Foundation. Mm-hmm. What are some other grant funding organizations that you think are the top ones right now, or that are hot in the fields right now? What do you think, other than the National Science Foundation, what do you think are the companies out there, the private foundations out there that are giving the money, that are most active right now with giving grants?
Well, there's a number of different private agencies that give research grants. You know, there's the MacArthur Foundation and the Gates Foundation, but a lot of those opportunities are not really appropriate for the type of research that we do here at ESF. There's just so many little funding agencies that are out there. The agencies can choose to be included in the Community of Science COS Pivot or not. So sometimes it's just a matter of, connecting to the right agency. And sometimes a researcher could find that via a listserv that they subscribe to, or a professional agency, things like that. So even though we as librarians and as a staff here at ESF help people find research, individuals need to be connected to their own network of their peers to find funding opportunities that may not be available everywhere. So.
And before they get into doing the searching, they should have formulated a mental checklist or even a physical checklist of, this is how much I need, this is what it's going to be for, it's going to be used, I need to have so many staff involved. Do you find that people come prepared when they talk to you, or do you work with them on getting that checklist, so to speak, together before they get into searching?
I do to a certain extent. But most of our faculty are pretty focused here and know what they're looking for. It's the undergraduate and graduate students that are sort of just looking for anything. And there are some fun opportunities out there for undergraduate or graduate students, but it requires them to do a bit of work to find.
I've dabbled a bit in the databases we've talked in, and I know you can search some of these databases and just specifically search it for undergraduate and graduate internship work. Is that something you find that's popular, that undergrads and grads are using the databases to help fund internships, or is that not really taking off yet?
I don't think that they really, I don't think that they really use the databases enough for those types of searches. I think most of the time students are finding their internship opportunities via less formal channels, informal communications with faculty members. But there are some out there, especially some really cool ones from federal agencies like NOAA, National Organization. I can't think of what NOAA stands for.
Well, I think we're the National Oceanic Administration. Atmospheric Administration.
Exactly.
There's a lot of acronyms to remember.
Yeah.
And again, that's why it's important to have the Office of Research Programs at your school or your librarian to help you, guide you through this process.
Exactly.
It's a long road to getting started with your checklist of knowing what you need and then actually finding the right database. So we've talked about Foundation Directory and Community of Science, which is now called Pivot.
Exactly.
And we've talked about the importance of being connected with your professional organizations. It's very important to join the appropriate professional organizations and talk to your faculty. When we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about finding grants. Again, our guest is Linda Galloway, Associate Librarian from Syracuse University. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Conversations. We're talking with Linda Galloway, Associate Librarian at Syracuse University, and we're continuing our conversation about grants. Linda, we've talked a lot about ways that you can search for grants, but I'd like to talk about outreach, and specifically things that you've done, such as the Research Times and work that you've done with the Office of Research Programs. If you could talk a little bit about how you create the Research Times, your goal when you create that, your audience, and to just educate people and promote the Research Times. I think it's a very important tool for people to be using.
Well, I'm really proud of the Research Times. It was started, we're in our 8th year of publication, and it was started by Cheryl Liptak at the Office of Research Programs, and we have upgraded it throughout the years. So right now it's a twice monthly publication, and it contains funding opportunities and information relevant to ESF, primarily ESF faculty and staff who are conducting research. In addition to the Research Times, every funding opportunity that's included in the Research Times, I think I already mentioned, is tweeted. So you can see sort of an immediate feed of what will end up in the Research Times in its twice monthly format. And the Research Times is available on the web at our ESF Grant Search website. And it primarily, like I said, just contains funding opportunities relevant to ESF researchers.
Do you feel that throughout the years you've seen a dramatic increase in the number of faculty getting involved with finding grants and the number of grants received? Do you think that you've seen a correlation between the two?
believe that more people apply for funding, but over these last few years, as you know, many funding dollars have dried up and have become more competitive. So while our researchers are prolific and are getting grants, there's not been a dramatic increase. There's a lot of incidental and anecdotal information that we have that people really enjoy looking at it, and it's a good way to find funding opportunities that they can now be less reliant on sort of informal ways that they had prior to this of finding funding.
So the Research Times, you send it out via email. It's on a special website, which you said was called the
ESF Grant Search.
And the full website of that, just so we know, is www.esf.edu/ is it just research grants? Or?
I think you can get to it through the Office of Research Programs website from esf.edu/research.
Okay. And so you've been talking about, you've gone electronic with this, you now have the website, you now use Twitter with it. What do you see on the horizon for grant research, for either doing the research or what kind of work that Office of Research Programs anywhere could be doing with technology and social media? Do you have any visions of what your dream would be for the Research Times, or what your dream would be for a grants database?
I wish that grants databases were more user-friendly because they're really a lot more confusing, like I said, than the databases that we would be more familiar with library research.
Now you say, I mean, we're both librarians, we know how to manipulate these databases, but to a user, how when you say it's confusing and it's busy, for example, do you think there's too many search options? Is it just not clear?
I think
what the options are?
I think both. There's too many search options in many cases, and people don't know how to limit their searches effectively, where they're either retrieving way too few results or way too many. It is a difficult balance to find, I think. But these tools are becoming easier to use. There's a lot of, as you know, there's a lot of collaborative research that is on the horizon for many different institutions. So COS Pivot has another component that we subscribe to called Scholar Universe, and it's a way to connect people's research profiles with potential projects. So that whole interconnectivity is probably the future of grant searching.
Now, Linda, we've talked a lot about college faculty, academia. If I'm just a regular person who would like to do some research, are there ways for me to gain access to these fabulous databases?
There are, but in most cases, you would need to be affiliated with a university to actually receive the funding for research grants. So you have to be a faculty member or a staff member of a university to receive the funding.
Would the public library maybe have some of the databases?
Sure, the public library has definitely has Foundation Directory Online.
Okay, and then grants.gov. So if I'm I don't know, just say a church or a nonprofit, a business, a small startup, there are other options if I'm not a college professor.
Oh, absolutely.
Student. So there are other avenues. I could visit my public library. I could go online myself and find these resources. Maybe come across this conversations video and realize that there are resources out there. So if for some reason a faculty was doing work outside of the college for their own personal use, they might be able to visit, say, the local library to find other appropriate resources.
I would contact a librarian at your local public library because just about every public library, at least that I'm familiar with in New York State, has access to some funding resources that they are subscribing to, like Foundation Directory Online, and there may be others. And the Onondaga County Public Library, downtown, the main library, had at one point a grants librarian. Now there may be somebody there that could help with finding funding. So definitely contact your local public library.
Yeah, OCPL, which is the main library in Syracuse, I know they offer training sessions too. So it's important when someone's doing grant research to even check out to see where training is available. And many of the databases, I think, have training available now, either through webinars or through video tutorials, which I think is fabulous.
Yes, they do. And you know, you're getting trained from the people who have developed the database, so they really know how to help you find what you need. So definitely look at the help screens, the training, and contact your local public library if you're an unaffiliated individual.
Mm-hmm. So we've talked about many different people doing kinds of research. We've talked about Foundation Directory and COS, Community of Science, which is now Pivot. And we talked about grants.gov. I had a quick question about grants.gov before we wrap up. If I was, say, working at SUNY ESF, and I wanted to find a specific state grant, would I use grants.gov for that, or is there a different place to go to find just state grants for particular states?
Well, you can limit searches in grants.gov to some state agencies. They're not all going to be in grants.gov. If you're in New York State, you might want to look at some of our funding agencies like NYSERDA. And there's the interesting thing about state agencies is many are like a private-public collaboration. So these funding opportunities are usually found in our databases, like Community of Science.
Mm-hmm. So they're scattered. There's not like a New York State grants research website or something put out by the New York State government. There's not a one-stop shopping for that. It's kind of scattered.
Yes, it is.
Okay, so again, that's a good reason to have your checklist of this is what I'm looking for. So when you go in to do those database searches, you have your keywords and your checklist.
Right, and then you might want to look at some particular state agencies that may have funding available that might not be found in grants.gov or in some of the other resources. You will need to do some work on your own, really.
Yeah. So Linda, before we go, can you tell me your top 3 tips? If I were to come to you and say, Linda, I'd like to start doing grants research today, what are your top 3 tips that you would give me to get started? What do you think?
Well, if you're, I would say start by looking at the research times in the database that we have, ESF Grant Search, because on that database, on that website, you will find the database is described. You'll get some information. You'll see what kind of funding opportunities are out there. So that would be my first tip. The second tip is, I think you've mentioned this, Jane, make a checklist. Decide what you really need to have funded, and then the third tip would be to look at other agencies that may not appear in grants.gov or the Foundation Directory online or even in COS, and see if there's other resources that you may be able to utilize, and make sure that you're connected to your network of peers, so you find information that way as well.
Wow. Linda has offered us some really great tips today on finding grants. We've talked about several databases, again, Foundation Directory, the Community of Science, which is now called Pivot, and grants.gov. The money is available. You just need to visit your library, visit your Office of Research Programs, and get your checklist down of what it is you need to find a grant for and get started. So again, Linda Galloway, thank you for joining us today on Conversations. It was great to have you.
Thanks, Jane.
And we'll see you next time.